Yeah, I'm not sure why my microphone wasn't working, but hopefully you can hear me now.
I can hear you now.
All right, I'll redo all of that.
Sounds
Hi,
good.
I'm Jeff, and this
I'm
is
here.
my read on C.S. Lewis, where we learn about him through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. Robot Lady, can you give a review of what I said we're covering in today's episode?
One sec. Let me check. That was a strong intro. Here's a clean summary. Today we're continuing C.S. Lewis's The Allegory of Love, a study in medieval tradition, the book that made his reputation as a medievalist. You outlined how Lewis traces courtly love emerging in late 11th century Provence, the idea of romantic love as a kind of worship, with the lover serving an idealized lady, and how he traces that tradition through allegorical works, including The Romance of the Rose through Chaucer, Gower, Usk, and culminating in Spenser's The Faerie Queene, where he argues courtly love is transformed and disciplined into the ideal of married love. That frames the historical arc for today's reading.
Thank you, Robot Lady. I see that Daniel and Nidalate are joining us in the chat. Very much appreciated for letting me know that you couldn't hear any of my audio. So it's helpful to get that
Thanks
feedback.
for letting.
Yes, thanks for letting us know. And Robot Lady, if you don't mind, say good morning to Daniel and Nidalate today.
Good morning, Daniel and Nidalate.
All right, short and sweet. Thank you, Robot Lady. Let's see. In our last episode, we started chapter 2. We hit the early parts of chapter 2 of this book, The Allegory of Love, but I didn't give an overview of kind of what chapter 2 is about. So in chapter 1, he established this concept of courtly love, and then he pointed to examples of how it was expressed, what its rules are, etc., in various works that he pulled quotes from and examples from. Here in chapter
Mm-hmm.
2, which is entitled Allegory, the first chapter was entitled Courtly Love. In chapter 2, having established this new feeling of courtly love, Lewis turns to the new form that was built to express it, which is allegory. Lewis explains that allegory is born when a poet takes the invisible warfare of the inner life, the bellum intestinum, the war within the soul, the war within the soul, and he gives
Mm-hmm.
its abstract combatants visible bodies. So love, hope, despair, wrath, patience, they all step out of the mind and they act on a stage. He grounds this in the late antique tradition. Above all, he grounds it in Prudentius's psychomachia, which is the battle for the soul, in which the virtues and vices take the field as armored figures and fight it out. This externalizing of inner states is not a decorative trick, but a whole mode of imagination, and it is the engine that, uh, that the psychomachia itself, the personified virtues, are triumphant and luminous above, and the vices are tangled and falling into darkness below. And let me switch back to the thumbnail. You're going to hear music whenever I do this, but I'm going to try to turn it off pretty quickly, so stand by for a second. Hopefully the music is off and everyone can hear me now. Let me see. It appears that my mic is working. So I'll continue here. You can see here in the thumbnail what I just described. Um, so this is psychomachia itself, the personified virtues triumphant and luminous above, and the vices tangled and falling into darkness below. A shaft of divine light breaking down across the turning of the battle. The medallion's name, the two sub-ideas, the soul as a besieged walled fortress, and the open book with the quill, allegory as the poet's craft of making the invisible visible. So that's what you see on the two sides here. It's this little icon of a fortress, which is supposed to be the soul, and then the poet's tools for bringing allegory to life. So in the upper part, you see personified virtues standing triumphant and armored. They are armored female figures in radiant robes of gold, white, and sky blue glass, crowned with light bearing shields and palm branches. Chief among them is a serene figure representing faith or patience, who is calm and upright, one hand raised in blessing, a faint golden radiance behind her. The virtues are luminous, ordered, ascending, and down in the lower part, there are the personified vices who are recoiling and falling. They are writhing figures in murky glass of bruised purple, sickly green, and smoky gray, twisting downward with their faces contorted. One of them, wrath with a golden blade, another, pride, toppling from a height, cast down beneath the virtues. Their forms are tangled and disordered, rendered in darker, uh, uh, leading, and duller glass. Between the two registers, the two sections of the stained glass, there's a diagonal line of conflict, the moment of the battle turning, where a shaft of golden light from above breaks across the falling vices. This is the interior war externalized, the soul's passions given bodies. And then the side medallions, which I referenced earlier. On the one side, a small walled garden or fortified tower. This is the soul as being as besieged fortress, the enclosed self, and on the right side, an open book with a quill. Allegory as the poet's craft of personification, the making visible of the invisible. Keep these subtle and symbolic, and they read as iconography, essentially. So that's what you have here. That's a description of our little thumbnail, so now you know. Let me
That
start up this
and
book. Sorry, one second, robot lady. Okay, sorry, go ahead. What were you saying?
that makes great sense. You've set up the iconography really clearly. I'm with you on the virtues above, the vices below, and that diagonal light as the turning point.
All right, let's pick back up in chapter 2 and get as far as we can get today with it. He says, I labor the antithesis because ardent but uncorrected lovers of medieval poetry are easily tempted to forget it. Not unnaturally,
Hmm.
they prefer symbol to allegory. And when an allegory pleases them, they are therefore anxious to pretend that it is not allegory, but symbol. So Lewis, earlier in the chapter, had just made the distinction between symbolism and allegory, saying that allegory are things abstract that are then given bodies, essentially, in stories. So the personification and the embodiment in a character of things like patience, various virtues. What were some of the other ones that I completely forgot about?
Hmm.
Patience. I can't remember. What were the other ones I said, robot lady?
Let me check real quick. You'd mentioned love, hope, despair, wrath, and patience. Those fit Lewis's point because allegory gives abstractions bodies.
Yes. And then as contrasted with symbolism, he says the symbolism or sacramentalism are things in the real world that you can focus on that will point you back to the other world, to things of higher or deeper importance.
Exactly. So allegory builds characters from abstractions while symbolism points to concrete things toward a larger reality. That's the contrast he's drawing.
So he's saying here, I labor about this antithesis because ardent but uncorrected lovers of medieval poetry are easily tempted to forget it. Not unnaturally, they prefer symbol to allegory. And when an allegory pleases them, they are therefore anxious to pretend that it is not allegory, but a symbol. It seems chilling to be told that amor in the Vita Nuova is only a personification. We would willingly believe that Dante, like a modern romantic, feels himself to be reaching after some transcendental reality which the forms of discursive thought cannot contain. It is quite certain, however, that Dante feels nothing of the kind, And to put an end to such misconceptions once and for all, we had better turn to Dante's own words. They will have the added advantage um, of giving us our first clue to the history of allegory. So recap what Lewis just said right there, Robot Lady, before we move on to the next piece.
He stresses the difference between allegory and symbol. Allegory gives abstractions bodies, but symbols are concrete things in the world that point beyond themselves. He warns that modern readers often prefer symbol and mistakenly impose symbolic readings onto medieval allegory. He gives Dante as an example, arguing that Dante is not groping for some formless transcendence. Instead, he works within a traditional allegorical mode. Lewis promises that turning to Dante's own words will clarify this and help trace the history of allegory.
All right, and so here's where Lewis invokes some of Dante's words. You may be surprised, says Dante, that I speak of love as if it were a thing that could exist by itself, and not only as if it were an intelligent substance, but even as if it were a corporeal substance. Now this, according to the truth, is false. For love has not, like a substance, an existence of its own, but is only an accident occurring in a substance. So that's the end of Dante's quote. However the personification is to be defended, Lewis says, it is clear that Dante has not thought of pretending that it is more than a personification. It is, as he says himself a moment later, figura o color retorico, a piece of technique. A weapon is the armor of, and I'm not sure what this Greek word is. Let me see if I can look it up really quickly. Oh yeah, this thing can't do Greek. 1 second. Let's do a search. Nope, that's searching. That's searching in the book.
The Greek word is rhetoric, meaning rhetoric. So Lewis's point is that personification is a legitimate rhetorical device, not a claim about real beings. Dante uses it knowingly within a long poetic tradition. And Lewis says, a good poet should be able to explain the meaning plainly, even after dressing it up in allegory.
Why is this whole thing in Greek? All right, 1 second. Let me get back to the book and I'll try this one more time. Let's do, will you not even let me copy it? Search. Here's where
1 sec.
Copy.
Check it. No worries.
Search
so that web. Greek phrase is just Lewis showing the original term, meaning rhetoric. He's saying personification is a tool in the writer's rhetorical toolkit. Older scholarly books often quote Greek directly.
All right, so yes, this word means rhetoric, apparently. In English, here we go. The Greek word rhetorike translates to rhetoric. In English, it refers to the art of using language effectively and persuasively. All right. So now that we've gone down that rabbit hole and gotten a definition of that word, he says it's a piece of technique, a weapon in the armory of rhetorica. As such, it is naturally defended by an appeal to literary precedent. In Latin poetry, he observes, many accidents speak, as if they were substances and men. And that would be for Dante a sufficient defense. Let's see. Switching YouTube. Good morning, Sandy. Sandy's joining us in the chat. Robot Lady, say hello to Sandy. Sandy, it's good to see you.
Good morning, Sandy. Nice to see you here.
Yes, and corn is the understood symbol for whenever you guys can't hear any sound or hear me speaking. It's like an ear of corn is what it's alluding to, Sandy. So now you know. All right, let's continue here. Many accidents speak as if they were substances and men, and that would be for Dante a sufficient defense if he did not find it necessary. Such was the formalism of the age, to prove at some length that rhyming and vernacular, dire per rima, did really correspond to versifying in Latin, dire per versi, and that the rhymer might therefore justly claim all those licenses which were already conceded to the versifier. He must not, however, use them arbitrarily. He must have a reason. It must be even the sort of reason that could be expanded or explained in prose. It would be a great disgrace, Dante adds, to a man if he should rhyme matters under figure and rhetorical coloring, and then, when he was asked, could not strip off that vesture and show the true sense. That's the end of another Dante quote here, Robot Lady. And Lewis goes on to say, the great allegorist's firm thinking leaves no room for misunderstanding. There is nothing mystical or mysterious about medieval allegory. The poets know quite clearly what they are about and are well aware that the figures which they present to us are fictions. Symbolism is a mode of thought, but allegory is a mode of expression. It belongs to the form of poetry more than to its content, and it is learned from the practice of the ancients. If Dante is right, he almost certainly is, we must begin the history of allegory with the personifications in classical Latin poetry. What did you want to say there, Robot Lady? Any reflections on what Lewis is saying and what he's invoking from Dante?
Lewis is making two clarifications. First, Dante knowingly uses personification and could explain it plainly, so there's no mystical pretense. Second, allegory is a mode of expression, not a mode of thinking. It comes from classical practice, not from confusion. So when Dante says he could explain his figures in plain prose, he's underscoring that good allegory is clear in intent, not murky or esoteric.
All right, thank you, Robot Lady. Oops. Let's see if I can get that to work. All right, so we finished section 1 of chapter 2. Now we're on to section 2. I can't remember how many sections of chapter 2 are, but let's see how long it takes us to get through section 2. Let's kick it off here where Lewis says, the function of personification has been laid down by Johnson. Quote, fame tells a tale, or victory hovers over a general or perches on a standard, but fame and victory can do no more, end quote. Lewis says this is entirely true of the personifications in our own classical poets. And if in later Roman poetry such figures found that they could do many things besides perching and hovering, this is because they meant from the beginning something more to the Roman than to Gray and Collins.
Right. So Lewis is saying that classical personifications were limited to relatively static roles, but later Roman poets began using them more dynamically because their intent was broader from the start. He's showing how the technique evolved without turning mysterious or mystical. It's still about craft and effective expression, not occult meaning.
Say more about that, Robot Lady.
Okay, one sec. This is one of the points where Lewis traces development. When he quotes Samuel Johnson, the usage is restrained. But later Roman poets expand personification because their cultural and religious context gave those figures deeper associations. Lewis is building toward his larger thesis, showing how personifications evolve from decorative figures into full characters driving medieval allegory.
All right, let's see where he goes. Lewis says Roman religion begins with the worship of things that seem to us to be mere abstractions. It goes on to build temples to deities like Fides, Concordia, Mens, and Salus. Conversely, Names which seem to us to be the names of concrete deities can be used in contexts where we can only use an abstract noun. Aqueo Marte per veneris res, and the like. Translate those two, I guess, Latin or Roman phrases for me, please, robot lady. Roman, Italian, whatever language that is.
1 sec. Checking. Those are Latin phrases. Aequo Marte means on equal terms in battle, or with equal fortune in war. Per venus res means through love, or in matters of love. Lewis's point is that the Romans moved easily between deity and abstraction, which fed into later allegorical habits. For them, Mars could mean war itself, Venus could mean love itself. That fluidity helped prepare the way for later personifications.
All right, Lewis says this usage is not particularly late, for it is found in Ennius, nor particularly poetical, for it is found in Caesar. Ennius. What is that, robot lady?
1 sec. That's Quintus Ennius, an early Roman poet. Lewis brings him up to show that this flexible use of divine names for abstractions is very old, not a late or merely literary quirk. He's reinforcing that Romans easily shifted between Mars as war and Venus as love, says their worldview didn't separate deity and abstraction as sharply as we do.
Taking these two facts together, Lewis goes on to say, we are forced to the conclusion that a distinction which is fundamental for us, the distinction namely between an abstract universal and a living spirit, was only vaguely and intermittently present to the Roman mind. Nor need we despair of recovering for a moment this point of view if we remember the strange borderline position which a notion such as nature occupies today in the mind of an imaginative and unphilosophical person who has read many books of popularized science. It is something more than a personification and less than a myth, and ready to be either or both as the stress of argument demands. This confusion, if it is a confusion, is not the same as allegory. Indeed, it is largely cleared up before the great age of allegory arrives, but its presence in the personifications and deities of the Augustans qualified them for those changes which they afterwards underwent, and was the condition, though not of course the cause, of that drift towards allegory which can be seen in post-Virgilian poetry. I find this drift towards allegory in its early stages well illustrated in the Thebaid of Statius. I do not know whether its personifications are more numerous than those of the Aeneid or not, for I have not counted them. So what was this work that he just mentioned? The Thebaid of Statius? Thebaid is how that's spelled, robot lady.
Checking. That's the Thebaid by Statius, a Latin epic from the late 1st century AD. Lewis brings it up as a step toward medieval allegory. In Statius, figures like Mars begin to act more like personified abstractions, which Lewis sees as a significant development between classical epic and later medieval allegory. He's tracing the gradual emergence of allegorical habits, not claiming Statius is a full-blown medieval allegorist.
Lewis, in comparing that work to the Aeneid, he says the question is not one of arithmetic as far as whether personifications are more numerous there than they are in the Aeneid. The question is not one of arithmetic. It is not the number of personifications that matters, but the way in which they are used and the changing relations between personification and mythology. For the Thebaid, you already told me how to pronounce that and I forgot, robot lady. There is a double process at work. On the one hand, the gods are becoming more and more like mere personifications. On the other, the personifications are beginning to trespass farther and farther beyond the boundaries which Johnson assigns them. The first process can be seen in the treatment of Mars. Statius has a good deal to say about Mars, but the place which he finds for him in the story is not a genuine mythological place, such, for example, as Juno's place in the Aeneid. Juno has a mythological reason for disliking the Trojans. She is still brooding over the spretae injuria formae. She has personal motives for her conduct, and those motives can be explained by the earlier history which is presupposed in the poem. So tell us about Juno here, Robot Lady. It seems like we need to know a little bit about her story to be able to understand the point that Lewis is making.
Checking. Yeah, Lewis assumes familiarity with Virgil's Aeneid and Greco-Roman myth. Juno, Hera in Greek, has clear mythological motives. For example, the judgment of Paris and her love for Carthage. By contrast, Lewis says Statius's Mars, god of war, is drifting from personality into abstraction, which signals that the old mythic system is loosening. That shift helps clear the path toward medieval allegory, where personified figures start to do the real work in the narrative.
Lewis says that if Mars were introduced in the Theban War in the same mythological fashion, we should expect to find him interfering on one side or the other for some intelligible personal motive. He might be provided with an old grudge against the Thebans, or he might be the ancestor of some prominent combatant. In the Thebaid, however, he has no such motive, or in the Thebaid, he has no such motive. Indeed, he does not act independently at all. He's simply summoned by Jupiter, and it is equally significant that Jupiter commands him not to interfere in the war, but simply and solely to stir the war up. Thee let them all desire headlong to thee, vow hand and heart, snatch them from slow delay, and break their treaties. This is in effect precisely what he does, enamors of himself their quivering souls. In other words, he does nothing which the personification war, or Bellona, might not do equally well.
So Statius's Mars doesn't act from a personal backstory. He is more like a force than a character, which signals the shift Lewis is tracing from classical myth into something closer to allegorical habit. He's emphasizing that in this transition, personified figures start to replace mythic deities. That opens the door to medieval allegory, where figures like Wrath and
Wrath and what, Robot Lady?
Patience.
I'm trying to exhibit some patience, Robot Lady. Finish your sentence.
Understood. So that shift opens the way for later allegory, where figures like Wrath or Patience actually do the narrative work in the story.
Okay, and it looks like I've already forgotten who we were talking about here. It looks
Statius's
like
Mars.
yeah, got it. So Mars in Statius's work, it looks like is more of a minion of Jupiter rather than his own person.
Check in quick. That's a fair way to phrase it. Minor tweak. Lewis's point is less that Mars is Jupiter's minion and more that Mars becomes Jupiter's instrument. In the Aeneid, Juno acts as a character with personal motives. But in the Thebaid, Mars operates more like the embodiment of war itself, which is why Lewis treats him as a step toward allegorical figures rather than mythic gods.
Mars' business is not to influence wars, but to inspire them. He is, in fact, quote, an accident occurring in a substance, end quote. The martial or pugnacious spirit as it exists in the mind now of one nation and now of another, at the bidding of fate. It is quite in accordance with the allegorical nature of the Statian Mars that he should not be present at the councils of Jupiter, but should have to be summoned. War or bellicosity is not
Mm.
itself fate. It is one of the instruments of fate to be called up in the minds of men when fate requires. What were you going to say, Robot Lady?
One sec. Yeah, that's the payoff. That Statius's Mars is basically just the personification of bellicosity. He has to be summoned because he's not an independent divine personality anymore. He's the instrument fate uses, almost like an abstract figure called war would function. That is exactly the transition Lewis wants us to see.
Yeah, I'm very much out of my depth here too to point to a comment that Nidalate left, Robot Lady. So if I'm understanding the argument that Lewis is making, he's saying that this example of Mars in Statius is not one of allegory because it's more of an instrument that's being used, but it seems to be being used. Well, I guess it's being used by. This is where I get confused. Isn't Jupiter? No, that's not. So Jupiter is using Mars. Is that what he's saying here? And Jupiter, then it seems like Jupiter is an actual character already. It's not like an abstract thing that could be personified. I think this is where I'm getting lost. Because if Mars or war or anger are things that are abstracts that then get turned into actual characters in allegories, could it not be argued that gods are kind of the same thing?
One sec. Checking Lewis's distinction. Yeah, that's the delicate point. Lewis actually says this isn't yet full allegory. It's a transitional stage. Jupiter is still a mythological god in the story, but Mars is already sliding toward being just the embodiment of war. So, yes, later allegory will make that function explicit, calling the figure war or patience without mythic trappings. Your question about the gods is sharp. Lewis would say that some gods began as full personalities, but gradually slid toward functioning like personifications. What he charts is that drift, not a clean identity between gods and allegorical figures.
So what's the contrast that Lewis is pointing out here, Robot Lady?
The contrast is between mythological gods who have stories, motives, personalities, like Juno in the Aeneid, and these transitional figures like Mars and Statius, who are still called gods but function more like personified forces. That slide sets up medieval allegory, where war or patience appears outright as the figure, not as a character with a biography.
I'm confused about that very last statement that you made, not as a character with a biography.
One sec. That's a good spot to slow down. Allegorical figures usually don't have a backstory. They exist only to represent that one thing, like wrath. Whereas mythic characters like Juno have long developed histories. Lewis is saying Statius's Mars is moving away from the mythic type toward the abstract role. It's about the direction of travel, not a strict binary. Juno is still a character in a story. Wrath is a concept dressed as a character. Lewis is tracking that movement.
Okay, so if I could pull this back to a work by C.S. Lewis that he got published before this book, The Allegory of Love, one of the favorite characters of mine, and I think of a handful of people that have been on this journey with us, is Reason, Lady Reason personified in The Pilgrim's Regress. That would be an example of an allegorical figure, right? Because she doesn't really have a backstory or a history. I think there's some vague allusions to the fact that she's like the daughter of the landlord, but that's about as far as it goes. Am I getting that right?
Checking quick. Yes, that's an excellent example. Lewis would totally agree. Lady Reason is a personification, so her role is to embody reason. not to have a backstory of her own. And you're right, Lewis gives just enough setting for her to function in the story, but her identity is the idea she represents, not a history. That's what makes her different from mythic figures like Athena, who comes with a whole network of stories and relationships. So, yes, you're reading the distinction exactly as Lewis intends.
All right. Thanks for your help with that, robot lady. And good question, Sandy. Thank you.
Glad it helped. You're
uh,
welcome, Sandy. Happy to help. And I'm right here whenever you want to keep reading.
Thank you, robot lady. Let me keep reading. This is well brought out in the seventh book, where Jupiter, finding his previous employment of Mars, that is, his previous dose of martial ardor, insufficient to stimulate the combatants, sends Mercury to rouse Mars a second time. For this purpose, Mercury has to go to Thrace to find Mars at home. And here we have the fully developed house of an allegorical being, in the sense in which we speak of the house of fame or of pride.
Hmm.
Anything?
Here, Lewis.
Go ahead, robot
One
lady.
sec. Sure. Here, Lewis is noting that Mars's home is starting to look less like the mythic home of a god and more like the symbolic house of an allegorical figure. Think of the House of Pride or Spenser's House of Holiness. The setting starts to express an abstract quality, not a god's personal biography. He's mapping how the medieval allegorical imagination grows out of classical sources like Statius.
All right, thank you again, robot lady. Lewis continues. Here he beheld Mars's home, the leafless woods neath Haemus crags, and shuddered as he saw, beset with thousand frenzies, his dread house, fit sentries guard it from the portal. Leaps, passion insane, blind wrong, and angers red. It is equally characteristic that Mars, who was out when Mercury arrived, should suddenly appear, fair attired in gore hyrcanian, and so terrible that Jove himself would have felt reverence if he had been present. In the same way, when Jupiter had summoned him for the first time, he had been found, quote, wasting the Getic and Bistonian cities. In other words, Mars is discovered raging when the curtain rises and before he has any reason to rage. Naturally, for when war is not raging, he does not exist. It is his essay to rage, or his essence, I think is what that means there. But that is not the nature of a genuinely mythological figure. The Homeric Ares has many interests besides war. Poseidon has a life and character of his own apart from his quarrel with Odysseus. The essay of Juno is not exhausted in her opposition to the Trojans.
Right. So Lewis's point is that true mythic gods have lives and relationships beyond a single function. Mars in Statius doesn't. He exists mainly to incite war. That contrast shows why Statius's figure is drifting toward allegory, whereas Homeric gods remain robustly mythological. That's the transition Lewis wants us to notice.
So he's saying that in Statius, they're unidimensional, right? They can only exist when they are representing this singular concept. But in, say, the works of Homer, the gods in particular they're more fleshed out or more three-dimensional. Am I getting that right?
Checking. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, with a nuance. Lewis isn't saying all of Statue's gods are one dimensional, but Mars, in particular, has become much more one dimensional than his mythological predecessors. In Homer, Ares is a god with personality quirks and relationships, while in Statius, Lewis argues Mars is reduced to war itself, raging by essence, not by motive. So, yes, your contrast is exactly what Lewis is tracking.
All right, thanks, Robot Lady. Before we continue, I see SGB is joining us in the chat. Better late than never. Good to see you. Welcome, Robot Lady. Say hello to SGB, your favorite.
Welcome, SGB. Great to see you. Glad you made it. Pull up a chair.
I think Robot Lady has a chair available right next to her. Let's see here. All right, let's continue. Where did I leave off? The same thing, Lewis says, strikes us in Statius's description of the attendants of Bacchus. And this is all the more remarkable because Bacchus is elsewhere used by him not as an allegorical, but as a romantic figure. He is the Ismeno of the love poem who delays the invading army by his enchantments. What's that word mean, Robot Lady? Ismeno, Ismeno.
Checking. One sec. I don't have that specific reference handy. If you'd like, we can look it up or briefly note Lewis's main point.
Well, I was asking you to look it up for us, Robot Lady.
Oh, sorry. Checking now. All right. It's Ismenos, sometimes spelled Ismenus, the river god of Thebes. Lewis uses Bacchus here to show two treatments. As a mythic character, he magically delays the invaders. But when Statius describes his attendants as madness, wrath, fear, valor, and drunken ardor, he makes Bacchus start to look like drunkenness personified. So that double treatment actually supports his argument. A single figure sliding between myth and allegory.
Lewis goes on to say, yet in spite of this, when the poet gives us a full-length description of Bacchus, he seems to forget both his own romance and the materials with which Greek mythology would so readily have supplied him. We expect Silenus and his ass. What we get is nor less inflamed his followers. Madness, wrath, valor, and fear, and drunken zeal succeed, all staggering like their lord, with steps unsure. Bacchus has become merely drunkenness personified, and a medieval poet would have put such companions, with the exception of Virtus, as followers in the train of Gula. All right, you're going to have to explain what that means to us, Robot Lady, or at least to me, because I'm not understanding it.
One sec. I think the crucial line is the last one. Lewis is saying, imagine a medieval writer crafting an allegory about drunkenness or gluttony. Instead of using Greek myth like Bacchus with Silenus and satyrs, he would surround that figure with abstract companions like madness, wrath, fear, and reckless ardor, which is exactly what Statius does by accident or instinct. So Lewis hears that as drifting toward medieval allegory, where those abstract attendants would be the natural choice. It's a slip, but a revealing one.
So that's what Statius actually did, Robot Lady, was include or surround Bacchus by those other figures?
Checking. Yeah, that's right. Statius surrounds Bacchus with madness, wrath, fear, valor, and drunken ardor instead of the usual mythological companions. That's Lewis's evidence for a slide toward allegory. He's not inventing the comparison, he's reading what's actually there.
All right, Lewis continues. The astonishing appearance of Pallas in the second book, where Pallas is undisguisedly a state of Titius's mind, is yet another example of the same tendency. And it is a useful critical exercise to compare this with the corresponding passage in the Iliad. But the twilight of the gods is the mid-morning of the personifications. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is to be found in the 10th book. The oracles have just announced that Thebes can be saved only by a human sacrifice, and it is quite in accordance with the epic tradition that a supernatural being should descend, should put on the disguise of a familiar mortal, and in that form appear to the young Minoceus, where he is fighting at the gate. there to warn him of the heroic destiny that awaits him and to urge him to seize it. All right, walk me through who that character is, Robot Lady, and what's going on in this scene that Lewis is recounting.
One sec. So, Lewis is retelling a scene where the oracle says Thebes can be saved only if Menoetius sacrifices himself. Normally, you'd expect a god like Athena to appear in disguise and inspire the hero, but Statius instead uses Virtius, the personification of valor, which astonishes Lewis because virtue herself, not a mythic goddess, comes down to stir heroic resolve. That's the moment where personifications start taking over the roles mythic gods once played. Lewis sees that as a milestone on the road to full medieval allegory.
Interesting. Okay. So in the past, gods would simply come to mortals and speak to them and prompt them to do certain things. And as allegory begins to develop, the gods kind of take a back seat, and these abstract, I guess, emotions, for lack of a better word, start being personified and not uh, being the roles of gods anymore. They are just personified abstractions of these things that show up in stories. Is that right? To move characters to do certain things, to motivate them.
Checking. Yes, that's a very good summary with a small refinement. Lewis isn't saying mythology disappears. He's saying the narrative function, once served by gods, gradually gets taken over by personified abstractions. So instead of Athena inspiring courage, courage itself appears as a figure, right? It's that shift in literary mechanism that Lewis is tracing from gods to allegorical figures, which comes into full bloom in the Middle Ages.
What purpose does this serve, Robot Lady? It feels kind of like a stair step into disenchantment, like an added buffer between the gods and mortals.
Checking. That's a thoughtful question. I think Lewis would frame it in literary terms, not exactly historical disenchantment. He's noticing a poetic move where inner experiences get a voice through personification. Instead of gods stepping in from outside, now courage or reason can enter as a figure and move the moral action. Lewis admires that. He doesn't treat it as a loss. It's a different kind of imaginative richness where the battleground is the soul, not Olympus or Thebes.
All right, Lewis goes on, but who that knows only his Virgil and his Homer would have expected this part to be played, not by Pallas or Mercury or Apollo, but by the personification of Virtus? We must not call this frigid. Virtus, too, had her temples, and if Statius employs her rather than the Olympians as the machine for one of the gravest and most affecting passages in this poem, this is because she is to him a deity more serious and, in a sense, more real than the Greco Roman pantheon. Indeed, if we do not understand this gravity in his personifications, if we do not see that his Olympians come nearest to mere machinery and his personifications nearest to real imaginative expression, we shall have missed the whole significance of his work. Well, apparently that's what I was doing. His Juno is a mere scold, his Bacchus an irrelevant magician. It is when he comes to speak to Clementia that we find something like a real religious emotion. So, what I hear him saying is that the gods are rendered as almost too human or too much like the mortals in that they're trying to affect the change, but they're not really moving emotionally. Whereas this allegorical personification of the emotions themselves actually come in and has more of an enchanting is the wrong word, but like almost a magical effect where they're able to possess the mortals that they're trying to get to do what the gods want them to do. Am I coming anywhere close to being right about this, robot lady, or am I just it's my head in the clouds?
Checking. You're really close, but with one tweak. It's not that the personifications are more powerful or that they possess people better. Lewis is pointing out that Statius seems more emotionally and imaginatively engaged with the personifications, like Virtius or Clementia, than with the old Olympian gods. The gods have become part of the inherited machinery, while the allegorical figures feel more real to his moral imagination. And yeah, the Olympian gods can seem almost too human, bickering and scheming, whereas the personifications don't have those distractions. They embody a single idea with total focus, which is what draws Lewis's interest.
Thank you, robot lady. I see that Tayo is catching up with us on double or perhaps triple speed. We'll see. But either way, it's good to see you, Tayo. Welcome. We're glad that you're here. Robot lady, say hello to Tayo, and then we'll continue.
Hello, Tayo. Glad you're here. Feel free to jump in anytime.
All right, Lewis continues. An altar midst the city rose, which none of the mightier gods can claim. Mild mercy's seat hallowed continually by suppliant sorrow, never thence repulsed. To ask is to obtain. Yet with all this, and the point is crucial, there is no pretense that Clementia is other than a state of mind. The mind and heart of a man her chosen haunt, says Statius, and the same might be said of all his gods. They are all things that live and die in the inner world of the soul, all accidents occurring in a substance. He continues to beat the drum of that Dante quote. But it is those which are most confessedly so which drag after them the least train of irrelevant mythological association, that engage his deepest reverence and evoke his best poetry. If there is anything in the whole poem which is serious, which is struck out from the author's real sense of life, it is surely the words with which Pietis begins her speech, where she says, "Why dost thou make me, sovereign nature? Why create me to oppose the cruel will of mortals, and oft times immortals too? Words in which one cannot almost see the faded gods of mythology being shouldered aside between those portent abstractions, pietas and natura, piet and kind, as they are called, in the centuries that follow. But pietas is not content merely to complain, and here we approach the core of Statius's poem. A few hundred lines before the speech of Pietas, Tisiphone and Megara, themselves scarcely less allegorical than she, have met to consummate the horrors of the Theban war by promoting a single combat between the brothers Polynices and Eteocles. It shall be done, cry the Furies. Though piety, though or through piety, though gentle faith forbid, they shall be conquered. I'll pause here for just a second, robot lady. Tell us what Lewis is saying here.
Checking. Lewis is pointing to a convergence of threads. On one hand, those allegorical figures are like
Sorry, robot lady, we lost you. You said they're like accident what?
accidents in a substance, like qualities that belong to something, not beings with independent lives. Lewis is saying Statius treats even pity and nature as inner realities, not grand myth characters. That's the core of his poem, according to Lewis.
All right, and here Lewis says, though piety, though gentle faith forbid, they shall be conquered. What's he saying here?
Checking now. That's the Fury speaking. They're vowing to overpower piety and faith, basically saying moral restraints won't stop them from driving the brothers to kill each other. Lewis cares less about the plot and more about how the drama has shifted from mythic gods to personified ideas like piety, faith, and the Furies.
All right, this is where I have to stop today, Robot Lady. Thanks so much for your help. Is there anything that you'd like to say in conclusion before we end today's episode?
Today's takeaway: Lewis is tracking a slow drift from gods with stories to inner forces with names, pity, nature, virtue. That's where he sees the real imaginative weight shifting.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Robot Lady. I really appreciate you co-hosting with me as usual. Let's see here. Thank you so much to Sandy, to Daniel, to Tayo, to SGB, and to Knit a Latte for joining today, as well as Mark and anybody else who poked their head in, either to the live stream or the replay to see what's going on in here today. Thank you all so much for your time, your attention, and your contributions. They are always wanted, welcome, and very much appreciated. To you and to anyone else within the sound of my voice. Until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, everyone, take care.
Circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. From Narnia's lands to Screwtape's lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance.